In our previous video, we discussed the targets that are generated for the 3 FLDs that are displayed on each and every chart that the sentient FLD is applied to, and I introduced the idea that the targets from different time frame charts might differ ever so slightly from the position of the targets that we're seeing on our charts because of the different resolution of the data. And so there is a very useful thing we can do with the sentient FLD indicator. We can pull in the targets from other time frames onto the chart that we are looking at so that we get a better idea of not only the position of targets of much longer cycles, but also slight variations in the position of the target because of the resolution of the data. So let's do that. We are looking at a 15-minute chart here of the NASDAQ, and here you can see, let me just drag this price action over a little bit. Here you can see what happened overnight. There were some targets. These were the previous targets for both the 12-hour and 6-hour cycles. Notice how they're on top of each other. That is simply because at the time that price crossed those FLDs, they were obviously at almost exactly the same level on the chart, which does, of course, happen. And those targets provided us with a price level over here and a time over here. Price almost reached that level overnight. Take a look at the time at the foot of the chart. This is Central European time, so this was 3:30 in the morning, which is about 9:30 at night in the United States. And so price action would have been much diminished or reduced because it was overnight. Nevertheless, price almost reached that target, but of course it did so a lot later than expected by those targets. So because of that big delay in time, is it possible that some other cycle was drawing price up to reach a target? The way in which we can consider that is by displaying longer time frame targets on our chart. So let's do that. In the properties, you will see here a setting for plot longer time frame targets. That word targets is just cut out. There we go, plot longer time frame target arrows. So I'm going to select yes for that. And there are 2 other settings that are applicable to the plotting of longer time frame targets. And these are these 2 settings over here. Now, the first one we need to discuss because it is in fact a very important setting. That is for the longer time frame analysis. And you can see that by default, the number of longer time frames involved in the analysis is 4. So what this property means is that the indicator is loading data for longer time frames. The number of longer time frames that it is loading is defined by this property. In this case, it is 4, and I would recommend that you leave it at 4. What happens is that when the sentient FLD indicator performs its analysis, it starts the analysis by looking at longer time frame data. That's a very important part of the analysis process. If all that it is looking at is the data that you have on your chart, it does not have enough data to perform a really good, thorough cycle analysis. And so for a 15-minute chart, for instance, the indicator will load 4 extra time frames, in this case the 30-minute time frame, the hourly time frame, the 4-hour time frame, and the daily time frame. It will load the data for those time frames, and it will start its analysis with the longest time frame, in this case the daily time frame. And so your 15-minute chart cycle analysis is actually using information determined by analyzing daily data. It then refines that analysis by looking at the 4-hour data. It refines it again, looking at the hourly data and then the half-hour data. And then finally it performs its final refinement on the analysis by looking at the 15-minute data. Now, because the indicator is already loading longer time frame data, and the number of time frames is defined there in that property, it can also use that longer time frame data to calculate the targets for the different cycles on those longer time frames. And that's what this second setting is. Now, you cannot plot more longer time frame targets than are being loaded for the analysis, which is why these 2 properties need to be considered together. And so it is very important that if you change this number 4 and reduce it to perhaps 2, because you want to speed the indicator up if it's taking too long to perform its analysis, although that has never been a problem, but let's say you decide to limit the number of longer time frames, to only 2, then you will only be able to display the targets for 2 longer time frames. If you want to display the targets for more than 4 longer time frames, perhaps you want to display targets all the way up to the monthly level, so you're going to put a number of 9 in there for displaying monthly targets on your 10-second chart. Can't really imagine that you would want to do that, but if you want to, then go ahead. You can enter a number as high as 9 over there, but bear in mind that unless you are loading 9 longer time frames for your analysis, you will not see those 9 longer time frame targets. Okay, so we have chosen to plot our longer time frame targets. We are loading 4 longer time frames for our analysis, which is the default number, and we are going to be plotting targets for all 4 of those longer time frames. We click on the OK button. And now you can immediately see some interesting new targets. Let's consider them one at a time. First of all, I pointed out this high price that occurred overnight. It was indeed a target. It was the target of the 5-day cycle using the data of the 4-hour time frame. Look how accurately and perfectly that target was achieved. Interestingly, we had a 5-day target over here as well. That target was derived from the hourly time frame data. So here you can see a perfect example of the fact that the targets differ slightly from one time frame to another, from the hourly time frame to the 4-hour time frame. Why is that? It is because on the 4-hour time frame, you of course only have 6 bars per day. And so for the 5-day cycle, you would be looking at roughly 30 bars, a little bit less than that. But for the 5-day cycle on the hourly chart, you would be looking at over 100 bars. And in those 100 bars, it is possible, as price crossed the 5-day cycle FLD, that you had some whipsawing above and below the actual level of the FLD, which results in a slightly different target level. Which one is more accurate? In my experience, the one that is more accurate is the one that is closest to the signal cycle, which in this case, of course, would be the 4-hour chart, because the signal cycle for the 4-hour chart is in fact the 5-day cycle, whereas the 5-day cycle on the hourly chart is in fact the sequence cycle, which, as I've already mentioned, you need to give a little room to breathe because of the longer wavelengths. And so those 2 cycle targets prove very useful for this chart. Now notice the other longer time frame targets that we have over here. And let me just drag this chart over. First of all, we have from the half-hour time frame, the 30-minute time frame, we have a 12-hour cycle target. Notice here how this target is very, very close to the 12-hour cycle target generated by this chart, the 15-minute chart. And so there is an example where there is hardly any difference between that target level. When you see these target levels closely clustered together, that gives us greater confidence in the actual target itself, because of the fact that multiple time frames are all generating effectively the same target, or targets that are very close to one another. Now there's an interesting cluster of targets down here. We need to squeeze the chart a little bit so that we can see them. Here they are. Here is the 1-day target for the 30-minute time frame, and the 1-day target for the hourly time frame, and the 1-day target generated by this time frame, the 15-minute time frame. Notice that, of course, these targets are very closely clustered together. And as I have just mentioned, when targets are closely clustered together, we have increased confidence in the level of the target. That is certainly a target to look out for. While we're looking at these longer time frame targets, I'd like to speak about the time displacement of the longer time frame targets. You know that each target that is plotted on the chart on the basis of the interactions with the FLDs on that chart consists of both a price level and also a time expectation. And so this 6-hour cycle target is plotted correctly in terms of both its price and the time expectation for when that target could be achieved. The same thing is true for this green sequence cycle target, the 1-day target on this 15-minute chart. But now when it comes to the longer time frame targets, the time element of the target is not correctly plotted. The reason for that is because let's assume you are looking for a much longer target. Let's assume that in this case we were looking at a 5-day cycle target generated by the 4-hour chart, such as we saw over here. A 5-day cycle target would possibly lie several days in the future. And when you are looking at a 15-minute chart, you can see that we are only seeing a few hours into the future. We're seeing here about 8 hours into the future. And so if we had a 5-day cycle target generated by the 4-hour chart, but it was plotted 2 days into the future, the chances are we would never even see it on our 15-minute chart because of the fact that it is so far in the future. And so for that reason, the time displacement of the longer time frame targets is in fact fixed by a property in the indicator. And here is that property. It is to displace longer time frame targets. You can see that the number here is 10. That refers to the number of bars. Not only the number of bars, but in fact the number of bars multiplied by the number of time frames longer than the current time frame from which the target was generated. Let me demonstrate. The 30-minute time frame is only one time frame longer than the current chart, which is a 15-minute chart. And so the time element of this target is calculated by simply plotting the target 10 bars into the future. And so that is our 10-bar displacement. That is our property of 10 bars. If we change that property to 5, then the target would be displaced by only 5 bars into the future. The 1-hour time frame has generated the same 1-day cycle target, but it is displaced by 2 times 10 bars. So in fact there are another 10 bars over here. The reason why it is displaced by an additional 10 bars is because the hourly time frame is one time frame longer, again compared to the 30-minute time frame, or 2 time frames longer than the 15-minute time frame. This displacement of the time element of the longer time frame targets applies when these targets are in the future, as you can see in this example here. It also applies when these targets have not been achieved and they were expected in the past. If that is the case, there would simply be plotted 10 bars into the past multiplied by the number of time frames. And so an hourly time frame target that has not been achieved and was expected to occur in the past would be plotted over here. 20 bars in the past. When a longer time frame target is achieved, it is of course plotted at the exact bar and price level at which it was achieved, as you can see in these examples over here. Let's take a look at another time frame so that you get a better idea of these multi-time frame targets. Here is the 4-hour time frame, or 240 minute. Let's just zoom in a little bit so that we can see this in greater detail. Notice here we're getting targets from the daily chart. This is the 40-day target on the daily chart, and here we have a target from the weekly chart. Here, interestingly, we get some very clustered targets. They are the targets for the 20-day and also, I think, the 10-day cycles that are really pretty much right on top of each other. So that was also an important peak at that point there. Here is that 5-day cycle target that we saw on the 15-minute chart, displayed here on the 4-hour chart, and as you can see it was just achieved at that high price over there. Interestingly, the previous 5-day cycle target was over here below price. That's an interesting target, isn't it? Because it was expected 1 bar after this actual low price formed over here. And of course it was expected a bit lower than that low price. That's an example of a target that was not achieved. When a target is not achieved, a downside target is not achieved, it tells us that there is bullishness in the market, more bullishness than the cycles would lead us to expect. We could in fact even measure that bullishness by measuring the distance by which the target failed to be achieved, and we could define this amount of extra price that was not fulfilled on the way way down to the target as the amount of extra bullishness that is present in this market at the moment.